The Korean billionaire CEO with his mistress ignored his wife's call. He never knew it was her final one. The phone vibrated on the polished table between crystal glasses and soft candlelight. Once, twice, 3 times. June glanced at the screen and frowned. Wife. The rain hammered against the windows of the luxury hotel suite in Singapore. Each drop a staccato beat that Lee Jae-won barely noticed. He was too focused on the woman beside him, her laughter filling the space between champagne toasts and stolen moments. His phone buzzed on a marble nightstand, his wife's name illuminating the screen for the 3rd time that evening. He glanced at it, then away. "Ignore it," whispered Minesio, tracing her finger along his collar. "You're here with me now." Jae-won was the CEO of Hanseon Electronics, a tech empire worth billions that he'd inherited from his father and transformed into a global powerhouse. At 47, he commanded boardrooms with the same intensity he'd once used to climb from middle management to the executive suite after his father's unexpected death. His wife, Yoon, he had been there since the beginning. Through the 18-hour days, the risky acquisitions, the moments when bankruptcy seemed inevitable, when creditors circled like vultures, and every decision felt like it could be their last. But that was 23 years ago. Now, success had made him restless. The phone stopped buzzing. Jae-won exhaled and pulled Min Seo closer. She was 29, an actress whose career he quietly boosted through strategic sponsorships and carefully placed investments in the entertainment companies that control her projects. She represented everything his structured life wasn't. Spontaneity, passion, the thrill of secrecy, the intoxication of being wanted not for his name or his money, but for the man he pretended to be when he was with her. "Tomorrow we fly to Monaco," he murmured into her hair, breathing in the expensive perfume he'd bought her last month. "I've arranged everything. The yacht, the casino reservations, the villa overlooking the harbor." Minesio's eyes sparkled with that particular light he'd come to crave. "Your wife won't suspect. There's a tech conference in Geneva. She won't question it." He'd become practiced at deception, each lie sliding out more easily than the last. The machinery of infidelity, well-oiled by months of practice. "I've been going to conferences for 20 years. She stopped asking questions a long time ago. His phone lit up again. Yoon-hee, 4th call. Something flickered in his chest. Irritation mixed with the faintest thread of concern. His wife wasn't clingy. In fact, she'd grown increasingly distant over the past year, retreating into her own world of charity galas and cultural committees. Her calls had become rare, perfunctory check-ins about household matters or their daughter's academic progress. For times in one evening was unusual, unprecedented even. But Min Seo was kissing his neck, and the concern dissolved like sugar in water. He switched the phone to silent and set it face down on the nightstand, a small act of dismissal that would echo through the rest of his life. "Where were we?" he asked, smiling the smile that had closed billion-dollar deals and broken more than one heart. Lee Jae-won had not always been a man who ignored his wife's calls. There was a time in the early days when he would have answered on the first ring, when he was 24 and she was 22, both impossibly young and impossibly certain that love would be enough to overcome anything. They'd met at Seoul National University, where he was studying business and she was pursuing art history, a degree his father had called impractical, but which Jae-won had found fascinating because she found it fascinating. Yoon-hee had been different from the other women in his social circle, the daughters of chaebols and politicians who saw him as a strategic match, a stepping stone to greater wealth and influence. She'd had no idea who his father was when they first met in a campus coffee shop, both reaching for the last remaining seat during exam week. She'd offered to share the table, and they'd ended up talking until the cafe closed, about everything and nothing. Her passion for Korean ceramics, his dreams of modernizing his father's company, their shared love of jazz music and terrible action movies. He'd fallen in love with her authenticity, the way she laughed without covering her mouth, the way she argued with him about business ethics and corporate responsibility, challenging his assumptions without fear. She saw him, not his family name. When he proposed a year later, his father had been skeptical. "She has no connections," Lee Dong-hyun had said, smoking his ever-present cigarette in his office overlooking the Han River. "Her family is middle class." What does she bring to this union besides a pretty face? She brings herself. Jae-won had replied with the confidence of youth. And that's enough for me. His father had eventually relented, though Jae-won suspected it was more because Lee Dong-hyun was too busy building his electronics empire to fight about his son's romantic choices. The wedding had been lavish. 300 guests, traditional ceremonies followed by a Western-style reception, coverage in all the major newspapers. Yoon had looked radiant in her hanbok, then later in her white wedding gown, and Jae-won had meant every word as vows. For the first few years, they'd been happy. Genuinely, uncomplicated happy. They'd lived in a modest apartment by their standards, choosing to save money rather than rely entirely on his family's wealth. Yoon had worked as a curator at a small gallery, and Jae-won had put in brutal hours at Hanseong, determined to prove to his father that he was more than just a boss's son. Their daughter, Ji-won, had been born 3 years into their marriage. Jae-won still remembered holding her for the first time, this impossibly tiny human who was somehow part of him and part of Yoon, a physical manifestation of their love. He'd cried, much to his own surprise, and Yoon had laughed at him gently while exhausted from 16 hours of labor. "You're such a softy," she'd whispered. "Only with you," he'd replied. "Only with our family." He'd meant it then. He'd truly meant it. But then his father had died suddenly, a massive heart attack at 63, collapsing in the middle of a board meeting. Jae-won, at 31, had found himself thrust into the CEO position years before he'd expected, facing a company in crisis. His father had been diagnosed with terminal cancer 6 months earlier and had kept it secret, continuing to make aggressive, risky business decisions that had left Hanseong overextended and vulnerable. The next 5 years had been a blur of crisis management. Jae-won had worked 100-hour weeks, restructuring debt, selling off unprofitable divisions, fighting hostile takeover attempts. He'd missed birthdays and anniversaries, school plays and family dinners. Yoon had been understanding at first, supportive even, managing their household and raising Ji-won largely on her own. "Do what you need to do," she told him. "We'll be here when you get back." But he'd never really gotten back. Even after he'd stabilized the company, then grown it, then transformed it into one of Asia's leading tech conglomerates, the work had continued to consume him. It had become an addiction, the adrenaline of deals and acquisitions and quarterly earnings reports. Every success demanded another success. Every achievement revealed a new mountain to climb. Somewhere along the way, his marriage had become background noise. Yoon was simply there, a constant presence he'd stopped truly seeing. She managed a household staff, hosted the necessary social events, appeared at his side for photo opportunities. They inhabited the same enormous house, but lived separate lives, their orbits occasionally intersecting over breakfast or at formal functions. He couldn't pinpoint exactly when they'd stopped making love, when their conversations had dwindled to logistics and schedules. It had happened gradually, like a photograph fading in sunlight, so slowly you didn't notice until one day you realized the image was barely visible. Min Seo had entered his life 8 months ago at a charity gala. She'd been the evening's entertainment, performing a traditional Korean dance that had been surprisingly moving. He congratulated her afterward, and she'd been charming and witty and interested in him. Actually interested, not just in his checkbook. They'd talked about art and culture, and for the first time in years, he'd felt like someone was genuinely listening to him. The affair had started innocently enough, or so he'd told himself. Coffee meetings that turned into lunch. Lunches that extended into afternoon walks. He'd felt alive again, seen again. Min Seo laughed at his jokes, asked about his day, touched his arm when she spoke to him. She made him feel like he was more than just a CEO, more than just a source of funding and connections. When they'd finally slept together, 3 months into their relationship, he'd felt guilty for approximately 48 hours. Then the guilt had faded, replaced by justification. Yoon barely noticed him anyway. Their marriage was already dead in everything but name. He deserved happiness, didn't he? He'd earned it. The rationalizations had come easily, too easily. Now, lying in the Singapore hotel suite with Min Seo, sleeping peacefully beside him, Jae-won told himself the same comfortable lies. This was just about finding joy in a joyless existence. Yoon-hee wouldn't be hurt because she didn't care enough to be hurt. Their marriage was a business arrangement, a social contract. What happened in Singapore stayed in Singapore. His phone, still face down on the nightstand, remained silent. He didn't know that on the other side, Yoon-hee had stopped calling. Didn't know that she set the phone down with trembling hands and picked up something else instead. Didn't know that while he made love to his mistress, his wife was preparing to die. Part 2. The Garden of Letting Go. Half a world away. In the sprawling estate in Gangnam that they built together brick by metaphorical brick, Yoon-hee sat alone in the garden pavilion. The traditional Korean structure, all elegant curves and lattice walls, had been her sanctuary for years, a place where she practiced calligraphy, tended to her orchids, and found what peace she could in a life that had slowly emptied of meaning. Tonight, it felt different, emptier, more final. Her hand trembled as she set down the phone. She'd known he wouldn't answer. For months, she'd watched her husband drift away, caught glimpses of text messages hastily deleted, noticed a lingering perfume that wasn't hers, observed the guilty way he couldn't quite meet her eyes on the rare occasions when they were in the same room together. She'd hired a private investigator not out of spite, but out of a need to confirm what her heart already knew. The detective, a middle-aged woman with kind eyes and a matter-of-fact demeanor, had provided evidence within 2 weeks. Photographs of Jae-won and Min S-yeol entering hotels, leaving restaurants, their body language telling the story that their lips wouldn't speak. A mistress, an actress, someone young and beautiful, and presumably less complicated than a wife of 23 years. The manila folder with photographs sat on the low table before her now. She hadn't needed to open it after the first time. The images were burned into her memory. Her husband's hand on another woman's waist, the way he smiled at her with an openness he hadn't shown Yoon-hee in years, the intimate way they stood together that spoke of familiarity and affection. Strangely, the discovery hadn't hurt as much as she'd expected. Maybe because by the time she confirmed it, their marriage had already been dead for so long that this was just the official death certificate for something that had expired years ago. Or maybe because the cancer diagnosis had put everything else into perspective, made earthly betrayals seem almost trivial in the face of mortality. Yoon-hee wasn't calling to confront him. She was calling to say goodbye, though he wouldn't have known it. She wanted to hear his voice one last time, even if all he said was hello. She'd wanted that small grace, that tiny moment of connection before she released herself from a life that had become unbearable. 3 months earlier, during what should have been a routine checkup, her doctor had found something concerning during her annual physical. Dr. Kim had been professionally calm while ordering additional tests, but Yoon-hee had seen the worry in her eyes. The imaging had revealed a mass in her pancreas. The biopsy had confirmed the worst. Stage 4 pancreatic cancer, metastasized to her liver and lymph nodes. The oncologist, a younger man with a kind face and gentle hands, had been as encouraging as he could be while delivering a death sentence. Treatment options are limited at this stage. Dr. Cho had said, showing her scans that looked like abstract art but represented her body betraying itself. We can try chemotherapy to slow the progression, but I want to be honest with you about expectations. The 5-year survival rate for stage 4 pancreatic cancer is less than 3%. Median survival is 6 to 12 months. 6 to 12 months. Half a year to a full year. Not enough time to watch her daughter graduate, to see her married, to no grandchildren. Not enough time for all the things she'd assumed she'd have time for. What if I don't do treatment? She'd asked. Dr. Cho had been quiet for a moment. Then probably 3 to 6 months, maybe less. The tumor is already quite advanced. Eventually, it will cause complications, jaundice, severe pain, digestive issues. Palliative care can help manage symptoms. But I'd maintain my quality of life longer? Possibly. Chemotherapy is harsh, especially for pancreatic cancer. Many patients find the treatment as debilitating as the disease. It's ultimately your choice. She'd sat in the oncologist's office for a long time after he'd left, staring at the diagrams of the human body on the walls, thinking about her options. She could fight, undergo brutal chemotherapy that would make her violently ill, lose her hair, spend her final months in hospitals and treatment centers. For what? A few extra weeks or months of suffering. Or she could accept it. use what time she had left on her own terms. In the end, the decision had been easier than she'd expected. She'd told no one, not Ji-won, her beloved daughter who was thriving at Cambridge, studying architecture with a passion Yoon he had once brought to art history, not her younger sister, June, who had her own family and problems to worry about, not the handful of friends she'd maintained over the years, relationships that had grown thinner as her husband's success had isolated her in a world of wealth and social performance. And certainly not Jae-won. What would be the point? He'd stopped seeing her years ago. She'd become furniture in his life. Necessary, functional, but unremarkable. He'd probably feel obligated to care, would go through the motions of being a concerned husband, and she'd have to watch him pretend emotions he didn't feel while he counted the days until he was free. She didn't want that. Didn't want his pity or his guilt. She just wanted peace. The pain had been manageable at first, just a dull ache she could attribute to stress or poor digestion. But over the past few weeks, it had intensified, becoming a constant companion. Tonight, it radiated through her like fire, stealing her breath. The pain medication Dr. Cho had prescribed helped, but not enough. Never enough. She'd spent weeks debating her choice. The cancer would kill her, that was certain. The question was whether she wanted to endure months of increasing agony, losing control of her body and her dignity, becoming a burden to everyone around her, or whether she could find the courage to end things on her own terms, while she still had agency. In the end, it hadn't really been a question at all. She'd obtained what she needed through connections she'd cultivated over years of charity work. A sympathetic pharmacist who'd lost his own wife to cancer. A doctor who believed in death with dignity, even if the law didn't. Small acts of compassion from people who understood that sometimes mercy looked like letting go. Her fingers traced the rim of the teacup beside her, delicate porcelain painted with cherry blossoms. She prepared it carefully, the concentrated mixture of medications dissolved into traditional Korean tea, not rat poison or anything crude that would cause seizures and suffering. Something peaceful, the pharmacist had promised. She'd go to sleep and simply not wake up. It would look like a heart attack or a stroke. By the time anyone thought to do an autopsy, it would be too late to save her anyway. And maybe they'd find a cancer then and understand, or maybe they wouldn't. It didn't really matter. Yoon, he had written letters. She'd spent the past week composing them in her neat, careful handwriting. The calligraphy practice she'd maintained all these years finally put to meaningful use. One to Ji-won, her precious daughter. That had been the hardest to write. She'd started and restarted it a dozen times, trying to find words that would explain without traumatizing, that would offer guidance without being preachy, that would convey a lifetime of love in a few pages. My darling Ji-won, it began. By the time you read this, I will be gone, and I'm so sorry I couldn't tell you goodbye in person. I hope you can understand and forgive me for this choice. She'd told Ji-won about the cancer, about her decision to refuse treatment, about wanting to spare her daughter the pain of watching her waste away. She'd shared memories, teaching Ji-won to make kimchi in their old apartment kitchen, attending her daughter's first piano recital, the day she'd left for Cambridge with tears in her eyes and determination in her heart. She'd told her daughter she was proud of her, that she loved her more than words could express, that she should live fully and fearlessly and never settle for half a life. Don't be angry with your father, she'd written, though she knew Ji-won would be. He became lost, as people sometimes do. But he loved you truly, and he loved me once, even if he forgot how. Forgive him eventually, not for his sake, but for yours. Carrying anger is like carrying stones. It only weighs you down. One to her younger sister, Ji-yoon. They'd grown apart over the years, their lives diverging as Yoon had been pulled into the rarefied world of wealth and Ji-yoon had remained solidly middle class, teaching high school literature. But they'd been close as children, sharing secrets and dreams, and Yoon hoped her sister would remember that version of them. One to the housekeeper, Mrs. Kong, who'd been with him for 15 years and was more family than employee. Instructions for the funeral. Traditional Buddhist ceremonies, nothing ostentatious despite Jae-won's wealth. She wanted to be cremated, her ashes scattered in the garden she'd loved. Mrs. Kong would make sure it happened. She was reliable in ways that mattered, but none to Jae-won. What would she say? That she'd loved him once, before ambition consumed him? that she forgave him, even though forgiveness fell hollow, that she'd known about Menecio and all the ways he'd slowly abandoned their marriage. She'd started a letter to him several times but could never finish it. The words felt either too angry or too conciliatory, neither truly expressing the complicated mixture of grief and resentment and lingering affection she felt for the man he'd become. Maybe the silence would speak louder than words. Maybe he'd wonder what she might have written and torture himself imagining it. Or maybe he'd feel relief that she hadn't left him with accusations and demands. In the end, she'd settled on a brief note, not a letter, just a few lines. She'd sealed it in an envelope with his name and left it in the drawer of the low table. Beneath the letters for Ji-won and Ji-un. If he came to the pavilion, if he bothered to look, he'd find it. If not, it didn't matter. Yoon, he looked around her sanctuary one last time. The garden was beautiful in the evening light. The carefully maintained paths winding between traditional plantings, azaleas and camellias, bamboo and pine. The orchids she'd tended for years were blooming, their delicate flowers a reminder that beauty was temporary, that everything beautiful eventually faded. She thought of her life, trying to decide if she had regrets. There were the obvious ones, marrying a man who'd loved her intensely for 3 years and then slowly stopped, staying in a marriage long after its expiration date, not traveling more or pursuing her own career more seriously. But there were triumphs, too. Ji-won, who was everything bright and good and strong. The scholarship fund she'd established for underprivileged students interested in art history. The hospice work she'd done, reading to terminal patients, offering comfort to strangers when her own life felt uncomfortable. Maybe that was enough. Maybe a life didn't have to be extraordinary to be meaningful. Maybe simply being kind, raising a good daughter, creating small pockets of beauty in the world. Maybe that was sufficient. The pain flared again, sharp and demanding. Yoon, he looked at the teacup. It was time. She dressed carefully for this final evening, wearing a traditional hanbok in soft blue, her hair arranged simply. She wanted to be found looking dignified, at peace. She'd applied makeup with care, covering the sallowness that had crept into her skin over recent weeks. When they found her, she wanted to look like herself, not like someone ravaged by disease. She lifted the cup with both hands, the ceramic warm against her palms. The garden lights cast shadows to the pavilion's lattice walls, creating patterns that danced and shifted. She thought of their wedding day, how young they'd been, how certain. She thought of Ji-won's first steps, Jae-won's hand in hers, his genuine smile before it had hardened into something corporate and distant. She thought of the life she'd lived and the life she'd imagined living. They weren't the same, but few people's were. Goodbye, she whispered to the empty air, to the husband who wasn't there, to the daughter studying on another continent, to the garden and the orchids and the beautiful, painful, disappointing, miraculous life she was releasing. She drank. The tea was bitter despite the honey she'd added, the concentrated medication asserting itself. She drank it all, setting the empty cup back on the table with steady hands. Then she lay down on the cushioned bench along one wall of the pavilion, arranging herself carefully, hands folded across her stomach. She'd wondered if she'd be afraid in these final moments, but instead she felt calm, almost peaceful. The pain was already receding, the medication doing its work. Her thoughts began to drift, memories surfacing and dissolving like bubbles in water. Ji-won as a baby, her tiny hand wrapped around Yoon-hee's finger. Jae-won young and passionate, arguing about philosophy over cheap noodles. Her own mother, dead 10 years now, teaching her to paint ceramics in their small apartment. Cherry blossoms in spring. The sound of rain on roof tiles. The way light looked filtering through rice paper doors. Her breathing slowed. The garden blurred, colors bleeding into each other like watercolors on wet paper. Somewhere far away, her phone buzzed again. Mrs. Kong called and asked about breakfast preferences for tomorrow, a tomorrow Yoon he wouldn't see. But she was beyond hearing it now, drifting away from pain and disappointment and the weight of expectations she'd never asked to carry, drifting toward whatever came next, oblivion or peace, or perhaps just the absence of suffering. Her last thought, surprisingly, was not of her daughter or her husband or any of the grand themes she'd expected to occupy her final moments. Instead, She thought of the white orchid with purple edges that had just bloomed. How it would continue blooming for weeks without her there to admire it. How life would continue with perfect indifference to her absence. And then she thought nothing at all. Part 3. The morning after. J1 woke to sunlight streaming through unfamiliar curtains, his head thick from champagne and too little sleep. Menesio slept beside him, her hair spilled across the pillow, one arm thrown over his chest in casual possession. For a moment, still foggy with sleep, he felt content. Then his phone buzzed on the nightstand, and reality crashed back. He checked the screen. 11 missed calls, 37 messages. His stomach lurched. The pleasant grogginess evaporating instantly. Most were from his head of security, Kim Sung-ho, a former military officer who never called unless something was seriously wrong. One from his sister-in-law, Jiun. Several from Mrs. Kong, the housekeeper. And one from Ji-won, sent 2 hours ago when it would have been early morning in Cambridge. His hands went cold. Something was very wrong. He opened Ji-won's message first, though part of him wanted to delay, to preserve the not knowing for just a few more seconds. Dad, call me immediately. It's Mom. 3 words. It's Mom. But the way they were written, the lack of elaboration, the urgency, his throat tightened. He dialed his daughter's number with shaking fingers. Ji-won answered on the first ring. Where were you? Her voice was raw, destroyed. Dad, where the hell were you? What's happened? What's wrong? But even as he asked, he knew. Something in his daughter's tone carried a finality he'd heard before, when his own father had died. She's gone. Mom's gone. Mrs. Kong found her this morning in the garden pavilion. Ji-won's composure shattered, words dissolving into sobs. Why didn't you answer your phone? She tried to call you. The phone records show she tried to call you 4 times yesterday evening. Why didn't you answer? The room spun. J1 sat up abruptly, disturbing Menesio, needing movement, needing air, needing to rewind time and answer his phone. What do you mean, gone? Gone where? Is she in the hospital? She's dead, Dad. Mom is dead. Mrs. Kong found her this morning. The police are there now. They need you to come home. Dead. The word didn't make sense. Yoon, he couldn't be dead. She was only 45, healthy, had always been healthy. People like her didn't just die. There had to be a mistake. That's impossible. There must be, are they sure? Could it be someone else?